Hey guys, Mr. Shaw and Miss Womack here, just hanging out on a Sunday, giving you guys some help on the presidency. So today we're talking about chapter 12 in your book, which is due in 1 week from today. You better do it. Sorry. Okay. Anyway, let's go ahead and get right into it. All right, so the first thing you need to understand, guys, is that the president really has too difficult of a job. Our expectations are really not realistic for what we expect the president to do. We expect the president to ensure peace, prosperity, and security, and their power doesn't really match what we ask of them. It doesn't match their responsibilities. So specifically more along lines with cognitive dissonance, Americans they want a strong leader, but they fear the concentration of power. You remember when we talked about King George in Great Britain and the tyranny that the Americans experienced under him? They didn't want a repeat of that. So we want our government to be small and limited. However, we still want them to solve all of the societal and economic problems that we face as a country.
The country looks to the president as someone to solve many of our social and economic problems. However, the president doesn't always have the power to do so.
All right. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get into creating and developing the presidency, specifically into qualifications. The president must be a natural-born citizen. He or she has to be 35 years of age and a U.S. resident for 14 years. Then they also serve 4-year terms.
And the president can only serve 2 4-year terms, but we will see that wasn't originally put in the Constitution. That was added in the 22nd Amendment, which we'll talk about on the next slide.
And we've only ever had somebody who was 41 years of age. Again, Teddy Roosevelt was 41 when he became president, and then JFK was 42 when he was elected president. And the other thing that we wanted to tell you is that the Constitution is not clear on the 14 years part, on whether that needs to be like consecutive or just however they need to live in the U.S. for 14 years throughout. We're not really sure, so we can't help you. Okay, great.
Sorry.
All right, so getting into the amendments, as Ms. Womack said, we have the 22nd Amendment there, but the first one was the 12th Amendment, where the president and vice president are going to be elected together. It wasn't originally that way. The president and vice president, it was like basically the first person, whoever got the most votes, became president, and then the second most votes became vice president, and it led to a lot of tension, especially because John Adams and Thomas Jefferson hated each other.
Yes, the 20th Amendment then, January 20th, 20th Amendment. 20th Amendment says that the president is inaugurated on January 20th at noon. It actually says that the outgoing president's term ends on January 20th at noon.
Fair enough. Add to that, on that second bullet, guys, you want to put in parentheses like lame duck. The president wasn't inaugurated until March under the original Constitution, and since they were nominated in November, it led to about 4 months of, well, not doing much of anything.
Lazy presidents.
So now they only have 2 months left. They just wanted to cut down that lame duck time.
And then the 22nd Amendment says that the president can serve no more than 2 terms or 10 years. So a presidential term is 4 years. He or she can serve 2 terms. But then how do we get the 10 years out of that? Well, let's say that a vice president takes over for a president who has passed away, and they serve 2 years of that previous president's term. Then that current president can then be elected 2 more times as long as he or she does not serve more than 10 years. So it's 2 terms or 10 years.
And the last 2 here, again, the 23rd Amendment, Washington, D.C. was the only city in the country that actually had nothing to do with the president when he was elected. So the 23rd Amendment grants the citizens of Washington, D.C. They have their own set of electoral votes. So they actually have as many electoral votes as like Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota. They have 3 because the Constitution says that every place has to have 3, and so now D.C. does as well. And then 25th Amendment, it establishes the line of succession, goes vice president, speaker of the House, president pro tempore, the Senate, and then cabinet positions in the order in which they were established. So, for example, Secretary of State was the first one, so they would serve first after the president pro tempore.
And then the very last one would have been the Secretary of Homeland Security, which was established in 2002.
Watch the show Designated Survivor for more on that. It is quite interesting. You're welcome. And Kiefer Sutherland is the boss. All right, moving on to what the framers had originally envisioned. So the powers that they're given, they have express powers. They also have inherent powers. Inherent powers are they're not actually listed, but they are essential for running the government. It's actually because there's a president, he has powers to do this. It's really weird.
Kind of like the Congress with implied powers.
Exactly. A lot, and it's not a lot of the powers you see in the Constitution. They're not exactly. A lot of them have developed over time.
Correct. Then we move to the impeachment process, and we've talked about this. Congress has the sole power of impeachment, and it's a two-step process. You first have to actually impeach, and then you actually have to convict. And we've never had presidents been convicted, but we have had two presidents gone through the impeachment, the first step of the process, and that was Andrew Johnson. He violated a tenure of office act, and he removed a couple government officials without actually going through the Senate approval process. And then Bill Clinton, under perjury and obstruction of justice, he was impeached, he was not actually convicted, which means neither of them were actually removed from the presidency.
I would even add into your notes that specifically the House impeaches the president. Which, again, the word impeachment specifically means to accuse of a crime, and then the Senate convicts. We've talked about that a little bit, but I would just make sure you have it down specifically. If you might not necessarily need to know everything about like the specifics here about Andrew Johnson and Clinton, but it might help you in the future.
Two good examples.
You're welcome. All right, so the presidency, as we mentioned, has expanded over the years. We'll see here that like Jefferson was he was the first leader of a massive political party. Andrew Jackson presented himself as the direct representative of the people. Lincoln mobilized the country for war, specifically breaking parts of the Constitution because he thought it was necessary. Teddy Roosevelt mobilized the public behind his policies. You guys learned about that in the progressive era of your U.S. history unit. And then Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, they both set precedents for presidents to serve as world leaders in like the Spanish-American War, World War I. You could probably even add FDR there as well. For World War II. And then FDR also developed the role of the president as manager of the economy.
During the Great Depression.
Do you want to talk about bully pulpit?
Yeah. So the bully pulpit is what Teddy Roosevelt used as his kind of platform to reach the American people with what he believed in his policies and what a president should do. And we kind of see that currently with President Trump. He uses Twitter and social media as what Teddy Roosevelt would have explained as a bully pulpit or a platform for him to speak or communicate with the entire country.
Like Teddy Roosevelt would have used like the press. He would have just like given a speech to reporters, and with the advent of social media, Twitter, things like that, it's become a lot more electronic and not really. We talk about him tweeting at 2:30 at night and stuff like that. He's basically always on, always trying to advance his policy agenda. So the perspectives on presidential power in the 1950s and 60s, again, this is all kind of evolved from George Washington. George Washington was a very powerful president, but not nearly as powerful as it has evolved into. In the 50s and 60s, they wanted the president to be powerful specifically because we were in the Cold War. There was a lot of uncertainty, and we needed a strong figure at the helm, making sure that our country was headed in the right direction. 70s, it kind of shifts a little bit. We have some bad stuff going on. We have the Vietnam War and Watergate. So basically just things that the president is not being very forthcoming. They're not explaining a lot of what's going on to the people.
There was a lot of distrust from the American people in regards to the presidency and the government in general.
Seems good. And then the Ford and Carter, they were considered fairly weak presidents. Unfortunately, they didn't. They just kind of had a bad rap. People were sick of Johnson and Nixon ahead of time, so Ford and Carter really weren't allowed to do a lot. And then once we get to the 80s with Reagan and then H.W. Bush, Clinton, so on and so forth, and I forgot they're on the next slide. But we have mixed feelings about presidential power. We don't really know what we want to do with them. We want a strong president, but we're wary of somebody taking too much power and becoming a tyrant. Moving on to 2000s, George W. Bush and Barack Obama have become the most powerful presidents that we have ever seen in history because of 9/11, because of the terrorist organizations across the world that we face and encounter. They have really taken it to the next level.
Yes. So George W. Bush, because of the events of 9/11, he goes on and signs something called the USA Patriot Act, and that has to do with individual surveillance of American citizens. And then Obama kind of extends that as well. So the presidency, their powers have extended, and so then the question comes up, how much privacy as Americans do we get, or how far can the president impede our privacy, with also keeping in mind putting into policy ways to protect the American public as a whole, with different surveillance options, etc.
I mean, it's always about the government's job is to protect us, to the citizens, and if they are not doing that, then they're not serving their role. However, where's the line? Where does the line be drawn? Like, how much do we like? If you want full protection, then you're going to give the government full power of surveillance, stuff like that.
But then you're going to end up losing some of your individual freedoms and rights to privacy because the government has to kind of surveil the American public and what we're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Seems good. All right, so let's get into the roles of the president. Specifically, there's formal powers, there's informal powers. I don't know. Do you think they need to get all this? What do you think?
I think they should be able to classify, if you see on an assessment somewhere one of these powers listed, you should be able to tell us if it's formal or informal.
Okay. So, guys, maybe the best advice then would be to kind of just get some different examples. So you see, like here, I'll use my mouse to show you, like we have enumerated powers specifically here, congressionally delegated power here, and then implied or inherent down here. Maybe just get a couple examples in each section, but you might not necessarily need to write the whole thing. So first off with the enumerated/explicit powers. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. They negotiate treaties, appoint ambassadors, judges, justices, officers of the United States. State of the Union address he's required to give that every year. Power to pardon without conditions, fill vacancies, and receive representatives of foreign nations. Moving on with formal, I'll let you do informal.
Okay.
The congressionally delegated powers is the implementation/execution of the laws. Again, that like the president is basically like the chief police officer. Okay, he's in charge of making sure that the laws of Congress are being implemented appropriately and that people are following those laws. And then the implied/inherent powers, he can establish a cabinet. He has executive privilege. None of this is mentioned in the actual Constitution. He can give executive orders, proclamations, memorandums, executive agreements, which are kind of like treaties, but they don't require Senate approval, and then signing statements.
Okay, and then we move to informal powers. And he has power of persuasion. The president has major power of persuasion, and he uses it in two different ways: private use and public use. So for private use, he's going to do things like have one-on-one negotiations with members of Congress. He's going to use a legislative liaison from the White House to kind of lobby congressmen, lobby an individual congressional members as well. So he's going to privately use his power of persuasion in different ways, as well as publicly using it. So publicly, he's going to speak and advocate for public policies or agendas that he's trying to push. He's going to use political rallies to do the same thing. We see President Trump using rallies almost once a week in different areas of the country to kind of push his legislative agendas. They're going to use the media. Again, President Trump uses social media to push his agenda, and many other presidents have done the same things with different forms of media. advocacy for public policy positions and agenda on White House government, attempts to enhance personal popularity to influence Congress. Okay, so all those are ways that the president can publicly persuade people to get on board with his agenda or policy.
And what you'll notice too is all of those are kind of weak, and that's because we didn't want the president to be a king, and so he has to be very creative in how he gets his agenda or his policies across to the people. All right, so let's get into the actual roles. These are the 7. No, that's 6. I thought there were 7.
There are 7.
I don't know which one we're missing. We'll figure it out. All right, so chief. The only one we're going to cover today is chief executive, and that one's on the slide, so we're going to be okay.
Yes.
So we'll add that. We'll make sure that you guys have that 7th one there as well. So let's go ahead and get into chief executive. So the Constitution specifically states, and it gives the president the power to take care take care that the laws be faithfully executed. He can appoint/remove positions necessary to run the government with Senate approval. Again, we talked about how President Johnson got in trouble with that. He can give executive orders, which the executive orders are regulations originating from the legislative branch, and you might add to that those have the
power of law.
Thank you. They have the authority of law. And the example, there are many examples, but for example, President Truman desegregated the military.
So an executive order is basically like the president issuing something into law without actually having to go through the long drawn out lawmaking process. So it doesn't have to go through Congress and get approved by both houses. It's something that the president can just sign into law. But most of the time, some of the time, they will be temporary issues. And then when the presidency ends, sometimes they go away.
They also have to be really careful because they can also they are subject to judicial review, and if the president declares something or has an executive order and the Supreme Court or the federal judge disagrees with it, they will just strike it down, declare it unconstitutional, so it's something that just to be aware of. Usually, I guess Congress doesn't have that same sort of thing as right. They are like, yes, it still happens, but it is. Since there's so many parts of the lawmaking process, it doesn't happen as often.
Right. When a law or a bill goes through Congress to become a law, it's gone through with like a fine-tooth comb, and all that stuff's going to be worked out. In comparison to if a president just issues an executive order, sometimes it's going to be very quick. The administration is going to get it done really quick, and they're going to issue the order, and then a federal judge can go back and say, this is unconstitutional. And a president, for example, President Trump, after he was inaugurated in 2017, issues an immigration ban. And immediately a federal judge says that's unconstitutional. Well, his administration went back and reworded it and added a couple things. And then later on, it was the second one was established that it was constitutional. It was allowed to be implemented.
Seems good. All right. So moving on, we're going to actually get into the cabinet now. So the first person is the vice president. And the vice president really kind of gets a bum deal throughout all of American history. The VP is usually just there to balance the ticket. So, for example, Trump, who lacked a lot of political experience, chose Mike Pence, who had been a governor. He had been a politician for a very long time. Sometimes they'll do it even in other ways, like they will. The vice president will be from a different region of the country that the president might be particularly weak in. Mm-hmm. But go ahead.
Another good example of how if somebody's running for president, they need to pick a vice president that a lot of the times they pick them because they're going to help them with votes or in the Electoral College. So, for example, when John McCain was running for president in 2008, he picked Sarah Palin, a female governor of Alaska, he was hoping was going to definitely help him pull in that female vote and hopefully up his chances of winning the Electoral College.
So, and it doesn't really always work out the way they intended. Unfortunately, like the vice president, there's really not a whole lot of jobs besides the president of the Senate and second in line for or first in line for the presidency if the president is unable to do their job. More recently, though, we've seen a lot of vice presidents really like up their game and become like really big policy leaders throughout the whole policy development process, just because we've had some good ones and we've kind of seen them kind of give themselves more power, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, in the last 20 to 30 years, we see presidents trusting their vice presidents and delegating more roles to their vice presidents. They use their vice presidents as diplomats to represent them. If for some reason the president can't be somewhere that's important, maybe it's a ceremonial event or something like that, they're going to use their vice president to stand in their spot. So the vice president, the role of the vice president is also increasing. And presidents are becoming more comfortable and more reliant on their vice presidents to handle things for them.
As we mentioned earlier, the reality, guys, is that this job is impossible. Like, so the job of one person running in the entire country is it can't be done. So now we see a lot more the president is relying on his staff, his people underneath him to make sure that this can be done effectively. All right, so let's go to the administering the executive branch itself. The most important part that you need to know about the executive branch, besides the president, is the cabinet. These are presidential advisors. Specifically, there's 15 department heads. They're called secretaries, unless it's the Attorney General. And then it can also be whoever else the president invites. They could invite their chief of staff, the United Nations advisor, an economic advisor, anybody who the president thinks could add value to the cabinet is going to be invited to take part in cabinet meetings. You also are going to look for specific balances. You'll see, I think Obama he was like very particular about balancing his cabinet between these things you see here: geography, gender, ethnicity, and party membership. I think that Abraham Lincoln was probably one of the only ones to have people in his cabinet from the opposite party, though. Most of the time it is people from whatever party the president has. Here are the actual departments in the cabinet. So you'll see the State Department was created in 1789 all the way up to Homeland Security in 2002. Do you think they should probably get this down?
Definitely make note of what the departments do, what their functions are, which lists it right there in front of you. And you definitely need to know these departments.
Yeah, so go ahead and write these down, guys. I don't think we're that worried about the year created, but it would be good for you to know at least have a general understanding of what each department does.
And it should be pretty self-explanatory with the actual title of the department. Maybe there's a couple of like Secretary of or the Department of Interior manages natural resources and stuff like that. But like the rest, Secretary of Energy or Department of Energy.
Pretty easy.
The
only one that I usually have kids struggle with is the Department of State.
Yes.
They think that means like interior,
Inside.
and it's actually outside.
Yeah.
So the state functions as the foreign policy leader. They are always included in treaty negotiations. Treasury is going to be deal with the economy. That's what you were looking for.
Treasury.
Defense again is formerly the Secretary of War. They are going to cover handle the nation's armed forces. Interior is going to cover natural resources, public lands, parks, etc.
Teddy Roosevelt was into that.
He was. The agriculture is going to help out farmers. Commerce is going to deal with businesses. You guys get it. So again, all of these are going to be important to know, or at least to have a general understanding of what they do on a daily basis. All right, so let's go again. So this is going to cover the executive office of the president. How would you is it? I mean, because it's not the cabinet. It's something separate. So
it's just a separate office of people and advisors that also help out the president on a day-to-day basis.
Okay.
So in their specific areas.
The executive office of the president.
Yes.
Okay. So specifically, you're looking for three things here. The Office of Management and Budget is going to prepare the president's budget to present to Congress. The National Security Council is going to link the president's key foreign and military policy advisors. They are only advisory, though. They don't really have any power, but you'll see like the chief. What are they called? The Joint Chiefs of Staff, which are like the leaders of all of like the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and they'll all meet and help the president out on national security issues. And then the Council of Economic Advisors, it's 3 members appointed by the president. They specifically advise the president on economic policy based on current and future economic trends, deal with like inflation, stuff like that.
Yes.
I mean, it all sounds super boring.
Right.
But
I
I
mean,
mean,
somebody's got to do it.
It's not our job to judge. All right. You want to take this one? I feel like we
Sure.
haven't
White
talked in a
House
while
staff.
before.
There are about 600 members within the White House. And they perform various day-to-day duties for the president. It can literally be from scheduling his travel or his flights or whatever it might be, to just being his secretary and recording down information that he needs, whatever it might be. The principal offices serve political support and policy functions. The chief of staff is responsible for ensuring all other staff are doing their job. So these are people who report directly to the chief of staff or maybe someone underneath him that he delegates. And it's literally just the day-to-day functions of the White House. That's what these people are responsible for.
Like we said, there's so much stuff going on. We need people to actually administer all of these duties, and like the White House staff are the ones that actually get it done.
You can look at it as almost like a school where we have a principal, we have a head principal, we have assistant principals, and then they have a lot of people working underneath of them. They're secretaries that are helping them out and supporting them on different duties throughout the day.
Perfect. Okay, so we have a couple other parts of the White House staff here. We have the National Security Advisor. They oversee National Security Council, which was on a couple slides ago, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stuff like that. The point person on national safety.
Yes, and then the legislative affairs, they're going to be people who are very well versed on how to draft bills and write them to where, if you're trying to get it through a certain bill through Congress, these people are going to understand how to write a bill to where it's going to look very good to Congress, and they're going to know exactly what to put in that bill to where Congress is going to want to get it passed for you, etc.
And that's really the hard part, is that the president needs experts to actually do that for him, because he doesn't have time to write bills.
And there's no way that he's going to be completely inept with all of these duties.
Right.
He has people. This is the reason why he has staff. It's because it's people who are there to help him on everything he might need.
Just like with the communication staff, you need a press secretary, you need speech writers, because these are it's hard for him to do all this stuff. I mean, I'm surprised he doesn't have somebody to brush his teeth for him.
He might.
That sounds nice.
We don't know.
Moving on. All right, so this, I don't think that you guys necessarily need to get this down. If you want it, this is just kind of a visual representation of what we just talked about.
It's just to help you kind of, in your own brain, compartmentalize where all these different people work and who they're under, etc.
Yeah, and if you wanted maybe to get the top part down and then add in the political support and then policy offices, it wouldn't be a bad idea maybe to get a few examples. But we don't really think that the AP exam is probably not going to have something this specific on it. But we've been wrong before.
That is true.
So again, that's your call, guys. But this is just kind of the visual representation of what we just talked about the White House staff specifically. All right. So the last thing is just about the First Lady. And the First Lady, we're not really sure if how important she's going to be on the AP exam. You never know, though. So the First Lady has no official position. What she has usually done is that she chooses an issue, and then she tries to get policies passed on that issue.
So, for example, we can talk about the Bush First Ladies. They both worked on literacy. Okay, so they would try to get literacy initiatives passed through Congress to help out children in schools, learning how to read, etc. We also had Nancy Reagan that worked with cutting down on drug abuse.
what we've seen is that a lot of the as the presidency has evolved, so has the first ladyship, if you will. These women are starting to
FLOTUS.
wow, thanks.
FLOTUS.
Okay. What you'll notice is that these women have really like stepped their game up. For example, Hillary Clinton completely ran a push to get universal health care passed in America, and it wasn't successful. However, that was a lot more responsibility than anyone had before, with maybe the exception of Woodrow Wilson's wife. He had a stroke. She basically ran the entire country while he was sick in bed. But hey, you never know.
And then we did have Eleanor Roosevelt, who would travel the country and advocate for New Deal policy as well for FDR.
Correct, and I think that's really good. That's really it, guys. As far as the first lady goes, you need to know that she chooses an issue. Like again, Mrs. Trump, she specifically targeted bullying and is trying to implement a campaign, to stop that in our schools. So we'll see how it works out. She's got at least 2 years to work on it.
Michelle Obama worked on healthy food in schools.
She's a fan.
You guys all hated that.
Guys, we don't want to waste any more of your time. Thanks for hanging out with us. We'll pick up here in the next episode of, I don't know, what should we call it?
We need a title. Start working on the title of our show. And maybe a fun theme song.
It can't be anything that we have to pay for, though, because we're poor. All right, Take it easy, guys. We'll see you next time.
Bye.